Few people notice this detail. Beneath the surface of every human interaction, a silent, invisible machinery operates, pulling the strings of decisions, shaping desires, and dictating actions without a single conscious thought ever crossing the mind. Modern civilization is built upon a foundation of terrifyingly predictable behavioral patterns. Deeply ingrained psychological reflexes that trigger a mechanical sequence of compliance the moment the right button is pressed. Imagine the natural world, where a mother turkey responds affectionately to the cheep cheep sound of her chicks. The moment that specific sound is removed, she will ignore or even attack her own offspring. Yet, if a stuffed model of a polecat, her natural enemy, is introduced with a built-in recorder playing that exact cheep cheep noise, she will fiercely protect the very creature designed to destroy her. Humans look at this biological programming with a sense of superiority, believing the human brain is far too complex, too sophisticated to fall for such simple, mechanical triggers. This is a fatal misconception. The human mind is similarly wired with pre-programmed tapes, fixed action patterns that are activated not by animalistic sounds, but by psychological cues. In a world suffocating under an avalanche of endless information, rapid changes, and overwhelming choices, the brain simply cannot analyze every single detail of every situation. It desperately requires shortcuts. It relies on these automated tapes to function. And while these shortcuts are essential for survival, they leave the mind entirely vulnerable to those who know exactly how to press play. The individuals who understand these triggers are the modern-day illusionists, the compliance professionals who navigate the social landscape with devastating effectiveness, leaving behind a trail of people who wonder why they just agreed to something they never truly wanted. This psychological exploitation begins with the most ancient, deeply rooted rule of human civilization, the crushing, inescapable weight of reciprocation. The rule is deceptively simple but possesses a terrifying power that transcends culture, geography, and time. It dictates that a person must try to repay, in kind, what another person has provided. The moment a gift, a favor, or a concession is offered, an invisible, psychological debt is created, and the human psyche is violently allergic to the feeling of indebtedness. To understand the sheer magnitude of this force, one must observe the bustling, chaotic environment of a modern airport. Amidst the frantic rush of travelers dragging luggage and checking departure boards, a strange, deliberate choreography unfolds. A brightly dressed member of a religious sect approaches a distracted traveler. The traveler, deeply immersed in their own world, tries to sidestep the encounter, but the individual steps forward and swiftly, almost forcefully, presses a delicate flower into the traveler's hand. The traveler is confused, startled, and immediately tries to hand the flower back, claiming they do not want it. But the individual refuses, smiling warmly and stating firmly that it is a gift, completely free of charge. The traveler is now holding a slightly bruised flower they never asked for, from a group they do not support, in a place where they are already stressed. Then comes the devastating pivot. Having firmly established the gift, the individual quietly asks for a small, seemingly insignificant monetary donation to support their cause. The psychological trap slams shut. The traveler, burdened by the immense, subconscious pressure of the reciprocation rule, feels a desperate need to balance the scales. The discomfort of holding an unreturned favor becomes unbearable, even if they actively dislike the religious sect, even if the flower ends up in the nearest trash can seconds later. The wallet opens, the money is handed over, the tape has been played, the mechanical response triggered, and the transaction is complete. The profound lesson hidden within this airport encounter is that the rule of reciprocation entirely bypasses the necessity for liking the requester. The emotional connection is rendered completely irrelevant by the sheer psychological force of the debt. Furthermore, the rule actively encourages unfair exchanges. A small, utterly useless favor, deliberately forced upon an unsuspecting victim, can routinely trigger a massively disproportionate return favor. The compliance professional understands that society heavily conditions individuals from birth to view those who take without giving as parasites, moochers, and outcasts. The intense fear of social ostracization forces compliance, making it remarkably easy for a skilled manipulator to exploit this deeply ingrained social conditioning. The target is trapped, not by physical force, but by the heavy, invisible chains of societal norms. The narrative of unseen influence deepens as the focus shifts from forced debts to the agonizing psychological prison of personal consistency. The human desire to appear consistent in one's words, beliefs, attitudes, and deeds is a fundamental driver of behavior. Inconsistency is widely viewed as an undesirable, highly flawed trait, often associated with untrustworthiness, confusion, or mental instability. Conversely, a high degree of consistency is normally associated with personal and intellectual strength. It is the bedrock of logic, rationality, stability, and honesty. Because of this powerful societal value, humans have developed a relentless, almost obsessive drive to remain consistent with their past choices. Once a stand is taken, or a choice is made, personal and interpersonal pressures actively force an individual to behave in ways that fiercely justify that earlier decision. They will convince themselves they made the right choice, no matter how disastrous the consequences might appear to an outside observer. Consider the incredibly calculated, deeply manipulative environment of the retail toy industry, particularly during the highly emotional, deeply competitive holiday season. Toy companies face a massive, predictable problem every single year, a massive spike in sales right before the holidays, followed by a devastating, prolonged slump immediately after. Parents have exhausted their budgets, and children are overwhelmed with new playthings. To solve this post-holiday crisis, the industry relies on the psychological weapon of commitment. Long before the holiday season begins, television screens are flooded with vibrant, highly energetic advertisements for a spectacular, incredibly desirable new toy. A child, hypnotized by the marketing, begs their parent for this specific toy for the holidays. The parent, wanting to bring joy to their child, makes a firm, verbal commitment, promising that this exact toy will be under the tree. This simple promise is the critical moment of capture. As the holidays approach, the parent marches into the toy store, fully prepared to fulfill their promise. However, they discover that the highly advertised toy is miraculously sold out everywhere. The stores are completely empty of this specific item, driven by the pressure of the impending holiday and the need to provide a gift. The parent is forced to substitute the missing toy with other, equally expensive toys provided by the very same manufacturer. The holiday passes. The child is somewhat satisfied with the substitutes, but the original promise remains unfulfilled. Then, exactly as planned, the holiday slump arrives. But just as the sales start to crash, the exact same vibrant advertisements for the original, highly desired toy reappear on television screens. The child remembers. The child points out that a promise was made. The parent, suddenly trapped by the immense psychological pressure of their past commitment, feels an overwhelming urge to be consistent with their word. Even though the holiday is over, even though they have already spent heavily, they trudge back to the retail store, miraculously finding the shelves now fully stocked with the once elusive toy. They purchase the item, fulfilling the commitment, entirely unaware that the initial shortage was completely artificial. A carefully engineered drought designed specifically to extract a second round of massive profits by weaponizing a parent's desire to remain consistent with their promises. This manipulation exposes a terrifying reality about human commitments. Once an individual takes a position, especially if it is active, public, and seemingly uncoerced, a sudden shift in self-image occurs. The individual begins to view themselves differently, reshaping their entire identity to match the action they have taken. The compliance professional knows that the most effective way to change a person's behavior is to first extract a small, seemingly insignificant commitment. A tiny, almost trivial agreement acts as a microscopic wedge, slowly opening the door to much larger, deeply impactful requests that would have been fiercely rejected otherwise. The individual, desperately trying to maintain internal harmony and appear consistent to the outside world, will continually agree to escalating demands, essentially trapping themselves in a psychological maze of their own making. The initial action alters their perspective, changing how they view the organization, the product, and ultimately, themselves. They become prisoners of their own consistency. blindly following a path simply because they took the very first step. The relentless drive for consistency is not merely a social construct, it is a deeply embedded cognitive shield against the excruciating pain of continuous, rigorous thought. To truly evaluate every single situation from scratch would require an impossible amount of mental energy. Consistency provides an incredibly convenient, fully automated luxury. Once a decision is locked into place, the brain essentially shuts down its analytical engines regarding that specific issue. It no longer has to sift through massive, complex blocks of information. It no longer has to weigh the heavy, often terrifying consequences of different choices. When faced with a similar situation in the future, the individual simply reaches back into the mental archives, activates the consistency tape, and mechanically repeats the past behavior. This mental shortcut is what allows the human mind to survive the crushing complexity of daily existence. But it is precisely this automatic, unthinking response that leaves the heavily defended gates of the mind wide open to predators. The individual goes completely to sleep, happily shielded by the comfortable armor of consistency, while the manipulator quietly rearranges their entire reality. As the journey through the landscape of human vulnerability continues, the narrative inevitably encounters the immense, overwhelming power of the collective mind. The psychological need for validation does not operate solely in isolation, it violently seeks out the comforting embrace of the crowd. When individuals are plunged into environments characterized by extreme ambiguity, intense uncertainty, or sudden, shocking unfamiliarity, their internal compass shatters. Unable to rely on their own paralyzed instincts, they immediately, desperately look outward, scanning the behavior of the people around them to determine the correct, appropriate course of action. This frantic search for external guidance is the foundation of the principle of social validation. A force so incredibly dominant that it can convince perfectly rational individuals to engage in actions that defy all logic, reason, and basic human survival instincts. Consider the dark, deeply tragic events that unfold when massive groups of people are collectively paralyzed by this very principle. A bustling city street, normally a symbol of collective security, can suddenly transform into a terrifying theater of apathy. An emergency occurs, a person suddenly collapses in agony, gasping for breath on the cold pavement. Dozens of people are present, walking by, fully aware of the unfolding tragedy. Yet, instead of rushing to aid, the crowd hesitates. Every single individual glances rapidly at the people surrounding them, seeking a cue, a sign of exactly how to react to this highly ambiguous, deeply disturbing situation. Because everyone is simultaneously looking to everyone else for guidance, and because public decorum dictates that people should generally remain calm and unbothered, a collective illusion of safety is instantly manufactured. Everyone observes a crowd of calm, inactive people, and the brain automatically concludes that there must not be an actual emergency. The principle of social validation essentially creates a state of pluralistic ignorance, where a massive group of heavily observant individuals collectively decides to do absolutely nothing, leaving the victim to suffer, completely surrounded by potential rescuers who are entirely paralyzed by the psychological weight of the inactive crowd. The chilling analysis derived from this collective paralysis reveals that human beings are profoundly, undeniably imitative creatures. The larger the number of people who find a particular idea correct, the more inherently correct that idea becomes in the mind of the observer. The compliance professional deeply understands this terrifying reality and artificially manufactures the illusion of a massive, heavily engaged crowd to trigger compliance. The laugh tracks inserted into terrible television sitcoms, the artificial lines engineered outside of exclusive nightclubs, the carefully placed bills resting heavily in the bartender's tip jar, all are calculated, highly specific applications of social proof designed to completely bypass rational evaluation. The individual assumes that if everyone else is laughing, waiting, or tipping, it must absolutely be the correct behavior. The mind relinquishes its heavy, exhausting burden of independent thought, happily sinking into the warm, comforting, and utterly blind obedience of the herd. The profound vulnerability of the human mind does not end with the overwhelming pressure of the nameless, faceless crowd. It extends deeply into the intimate, seemingly safe territory of personal relationships. While the herd provides a comforting illusion of correctness, the smiling face of a trusted friend completely disarms the brain's natural defense mechanisms. This is the devastating theater of the liking principle, a psychological battlefield where affection is systematically weaponized to extract compliance. Consider the incredibly lucrative, highly engineered phenomenon of the home demonstration party, a perfectly designed psychological trap disguised as a casual social gathering. A group of neighbors is invited into a warm, familiar living room by a mutual friend. They are offered refreshments, engaging in pleasant, light-hearted conversation, completely unaware that they have stepped into a highly structured, emotionally manipulative environment. The representative of the company, standing at the front of the room, is merely a facilitator. The true psychological pressure emanates entirely from the host. The friend sitting quietly among the guests. Every single item presented, every plastic container or cosmetic product offered for sale, carries the heavy, unspoken weight of that friendship. The guests are not buying the product because they desperately need another kitchen accessory. They are buying it because refusing to purchase would actively, painfully strain the social bond with their host. The compliance professional has successfully outsourced the pressure of the sale to the incredibly powerful, almost inescapable obligation of friendship. The guests laugh, they converse, and they hand over their money, happily surrendering to a transactional demand simply because it was wrapped in the comforting, disarming warmth of someone they deeply care about. This environment perfectly illustrates a terrifying reality. The human brain is exceptionally bad at separating the requester from the request. When an individual feels a genuine sense of affection for the person asking for a favor, the analytical engine evaluating the actual merit of the request completely shuts down, overridden by the desperate, biological urge to maintain the social connection. This invisible exploitation of affection does not exclusively require a pre-existing, deep-rooted friendship. It can be artificially, masterfully manufactured in a matter of minutes by a skilled practitioner. Enter the heavily contested, highly aggressive arena of automobile sales, where one man famously ascended to the pinnacle of the industry not by mastering complex financial negotiations or memorizing intricate mechanical specifications, but by relentlessly, systematically deploying the overwhelming power of extreme likability. This individual, officially recognized as the greatest car salesman in the world, understood a fundamental, incredibly desperate human weakness: the endless, insatiable hunger for validation. His entire empire was built upon a shockingly simple, incredibly repetitive system. Every single month, without fail, he sent out over 13,000 greeting cards to his massive, ever-growing list of former customers. The physical card changed with the seasons: a cheerful snowman for the winter holidays, a brightly colored turkey for Thanksgiving, but the printed message inside remained completely, stubbornly identical. It contained exactly 3 simple words: I like you. It completely lacked any sophisticated sales pitch, any mention of new inventory, or any aggressive call to action. It was a pure, unadulterated injection of manufactured affection, heavily delivered to thousands of mailboxes. Rational observers would immediately assume such a transparent, obviously mass-produced gimmick would be instantly discarded, completely recognized as a hollow, manipulative tactic. However, the human brain's reaction to flattery is remarkably, terrifyingly automatic. We are so incredibly desperate for approval, so heavily conditioned to respond positively to praise, that we instantly, unconsciously lower our defenses even when we know the flatterer has a distinct, ulterior motive. The thousands of recipients of these simple, repetitive cards felt a subtle, entirely involuntary surge of positive emotion toward the salesman. When the inevitable time came to purchase another vehicle, the mechanical tape of likability played flawlessly. They bypassed dozens of other dealerships, actively seeking out the man who had consistently told them they were liked. The masterful creation of this artificial affection heavily relies on other deeply ingrained, entirely subconscious biases, specifically the undeniable, highly discriminatory power of physical attractiveness and the comforting illusion of similarity. The compliance professional deeply understands the halo effect, a cognitive bias where one positive characteristic of a person entirely dominates the way that person is viewed by others. Research consistently, brutally demonstrates that physically attractive individuals are automatically, unconsciously assigned a host of highly favorable, entirely unverified traits, such as immense talent, profound kindness, and absolute honesty. An attractive person making a request is significantly more likely to receive a positive, highly compliant response, completely independent of the actual merit of their argument. Furthermore, we are deeply, biologically programmed to instantly trust and deeply favor those who appear similar to us. The master manipulator will carefully, continuously adjust their posture, perfectly mirror the prospect's vocabulary, and falsely claim shared interests, deliberately manufacturing a heavily convincing illusion of common ground. If the target mentions a love for a specific sports team, the persuader instantly becomes a lifelong fan. If the target complains about the weather in a specific city, the persuader miraculously reveals they recently lived there. These tiny, seemingly insignificant manufactured similarities act as highly effective psychological lockpicks, silently slipping past the target's natural suspicion and opening the heavy doors of compliance. The target, feeling deeply understood and highly comfortable in the presence of a kindred spirit, willingly surrenders their resources, entirely unaware that the entire interaction was a meticulously choreographed, highly deceptive performance designed exclusively to exploit their desperate, unconscious need for connection. As the narrative plunges deeper into the dark, incredibly disturbing labyrinth of human vulnerability, it leaves the warm, deceptive comfort of manufactured friendship and violently collides with the cold, terrifying, and absolute power of blind obedience. The human mind is not just deeply susceptible to the soft, gentle pull of affection, it is heavily, structurally wired to completely collapse under the crushing weight of perceived authority. To truly comprehend the horrifying depths of this psychological surrender, one must examine the dark, deeply unsettling confines of a psychological laboratory in the early 1960s. A highly respected researcher, driven by a desperate need to understand the unimaginable atrocities committed during the Second World War, designed an experiment that would permanently, fundamentally alter the world's understanding of human morality. Volunteers, entirely ordinary citizens from all walks of life, were recruited for what they were explicitly told was a simple study on memory and learning. Upon arriving at the sterile, heavily institutional laboratory, they were introduced to a stern, unsmiling man wearing a crisp, authoritative gray lab coat, the ultimate, undeniable symbol of scientific superiority. The volunteer was designated the role of the teacher, while another individual, secretly a trained actor working for the researcher, was designated the learner. The learner was securely strapped into a heavy, intimidating chair and explicitly connected to a series of ominous electrical wires. The teacher was then led into an adjacent room and seated in front of a massive, terrifyingly complex shock generator, featuring a long, highly intimidating row of switches ranging from a mild 15 volts all the way to a highly dangerous, explicitly marked 450 volts, labeled with ominous warnings of severe shock and ultimate danger. The instructions delivered by the authoritative figure in the gray lab coat were brutally simple. The teacher must ask the learner a series of memory questions through an intercom. And for every single incorrect answer, the teacher must administer an increasingly powerful electrical shock. As the heavily engineered experiment progressed, the unseen learner began to inevitably make mistakes. The teacher, following the absolute commands of the researcher, flipped the heavily weighted switches, delivering what they genuinely believed were agonizing jolts of electricity. At exactly 75 volts, the learner began to audibly grunt in pain. At 150 volts, the learner desperately shouted, heavily demanding to be released from the chair, dramatically complaining of a severe heart condition. The teacher, visibly distressed, sweating profusely, and deeply traumatized by the agonizing screams echoing through the wall, would inevitably turn to the researcher in the lab coat, desperately pleading for permission to stop the horrifying torture. But the researcher would simply reply with a calm, heavily scripted, perfectly detached command. The experiment requires that you continue. You have no other choice, you must go on. The profound, absolutely terrifying lesson extracted from this dark, agonizing theater is that the overwhelming majority of these entirely ordinary, Fundamentally decent human beings completely abandoned their own deeply held moral compasses. Despite their extreme, highly visible emotional distress, despite the agonizing, desperate screams of the seemingly dying man in the next room, over 65% of the participants mindlessly, mechanically flipped every single switch on the board, administering what would have been completely lethal, entirely fatal doses of electricity, simply because an individual displaying the widely accepted symbols of authority calmly commanded them to do so. They were entirely paralyzed, utterly unable to openly defy the quiet, unyielding commands of the authoritative figure. This deeply disturbing, highly chilling phenomenon forcefully demonstrates that human obedience to authority is not merely a conscious, rational choice based on a careful evaluation of the leader's actual competence. It is a deeply embedded, highly reflexive, almost entirely involuntary mechanical response. We are intensely, relentlessly conditioned from the very moment of birth by parents, heavily instructed by teachers, and strictly governed by societal institutions to completely submit to the overwhelming power of legitimate authority. This systemic, lifelong conditioning creates an incredibly dangerous, highly exploitable mental shortcut. When the brain detects the recognized, highly visible symbols of authority, it instantly, entirely shuts down its critical thinking capabilities. It ceases to independently evaluate the specific merit, the fundamental morality, or the actual logic of the command being given. The compliance professional heavily weapons this massive, terrifying vulnerability by simply adopting the shallow, easily acquired trappings of authority, completely bypassing the absolute necessity of actually possessing any genuine expertise or legitimate power. They boldly adorn themselves with highly impressive, entirely unverified titles, knowing perfectly well that the human brain will automatically, instantly defer to a doctor, a professor, or a president, without ever once demanding to see the underlying credentials. They meticulously clothe themselves in sharply tailored, incredibly expensive business suits or heavily starched, authoritative uniforms, deeply understanding that clothing is an incredibly powerful, highly visual trigger that commands instant, unquestioning respect and immediate compliance. They loudly drive incredibly expensive, highly luxurious automobiles, utilizing the heavy, undeniable weight of visible status to completely crush any lingering, silent doubts in the minds of their heavily targeted victims. When an individual is suddenly confronted by these massive, heavily engineered symbols of immense power, the internal tape of blind obedience is instantly, violently activated. The target completely surrenders their own independent judgment, highly willing to comply with the most outrageous, financially devastating, or deeply illogical requests, heavily shielded by the comforting, completely false illusion that the highly authoritative figure standing before them absolutely must know exactly what they are doing. The terrifying ease with which perfectly rational, highly intelligent individuals can be completely dominated by a completely false, artificially constructed facade of authority reveals a profound, deeply disturbing vulnerability in the fundamental architecture of human cognition. We are completely, blindly navigating a highly complex, incredibly dangerous social landscape using heavily outdated, highly rudimentary mental maps. The master manipulator does not need to violently force their will upon a screaming, highly resistant victim. They merely need to quietly, masterfully rearrange the visible scenery, slightly altering the deeply ingrained environmental cues until the victim's own highly predictable, deeply hardwired psychological reflexes completely take over the driving wheel. The victim happily, willingly marches forward into the carefully constructed trap, utterly convinced that their deeply compromised, heavily manipulated decisions are entirely their own. The continuous, highly structured exploitation of affection and the dark, absolute tyranny of perceived authority are incredibly powerful, massive weapons in the highly guarded arsenal of the compliance professional. But there remains one final, incredibly devastating psychological trigger, a profoundly primal force capable of entirely shutting down the rational brain and completely inciting a state of desperate, blind panic. This force does not heavily rely on the warm, gentle comfort of social connection or the heavy, crushing weight of structural obedience. Instead, it violently exploits the dark, deeply terrifying, and completely inescapable human fear of total loss. It operates on the absolute, undeniable premise that the human mind is infinitely more heavily motivated by the sudden, terrifying threat of losing a highly valued object than it is by the gentle, pleasant prospect of gaining an item of equal or even massively greater value. The profound psychological paralysis heavily induced by the calculated application of the authority principle completely strips away the comforting, deeply held illusion of human free will. We deeply, passionately love to view ourselves as highly independent, entirely autonomous actors, completely capable of making highly rational, purely logical choices entirely based on a highly objective, deeply analytical evaluation of the available evidence. Yet, the stark, brutal reality heavily exposed by these dark, deeply unsettling psychological revelations paints a vastly different, deeply humbling picture of the human condition. We are, in completely undeniable fact, highly reactive, deeply programmable biological machines, heavily driven by ancient, completely unconscious algorithms entirely designed for a vastly simpler, far less complex ancestral environment. The modern compliance professional essentially acts as a highly skilled, deeply malicious computer hacker, continuously, relentlessly probing the massive, highly complex architecture of the human brain, actively searching for the heavily exposed, completely unpatched vulnerabilities deeply hidden within our heavily relied upon cognitive shortcuts. They deeply understand that fighting directly against the massive, overwhelming force of human rationality is a completely exhausting, highly inefficient endeavor. Instead, they completely bypass the highly guarded, heavily fortified rational mind entirely, directly targeting the highly ancient, deeply emotional, and completely automatic centers of the brain. When the highly skilled car salesman deliberately, continuously showers their deeply unsuspecting target with a massive, entirely manufactured barrage of seemingly genuine affection, they are not trying to logically convince the heavily guarded prospect that the incredibly expensive vehicle is a highly sound, deeply rational financial investment. They are deliberately, masterfully pressing the deeply ingrained liking button, instantly activating a powerful, completely overwhelming flood of positive, highly compliant emotions that completely wash away any lingering, highly logical objections. The highly rational, deeply analytical mind is completely bypassed, rendered entirely useless, violently overpowered by the massive, invisible tsunami of artificial affection. Similarly, when the entirely fake, highly deceptive expert confidently struts into the room heavily wearing the highly recognizable, deeply intimidating symbols of immense authority, they are absolutely not attempting to logically debate the highly specific, deeply technical merits of their incredibly flawed proposal. They are deliberately, masterfully pressing the deeply ingrained obedience button, instantly activating a massive, deeply terrifying surge of psychological submission that completely paralyzes the target's ability to critically, analytically evaluate the heavily flawed information being forcefully presented. The target's highly analytical mind completely shuts down, heavily surrendering control to the ancient, deeply hardwired evolutionary imperative to completely obey the dominant, highly visible leader of the social hierarchy. The highly terrifying, deeply inescapable conclusion heavily drawn from this dark, deeply immersive journey into the heavily guarded mechanics of psychological persuasion is that our massive, deeply vulnerable reliance on these completely automated, highly reflexive mental shortcuts leaves us entirely exposed to continuous, highly devastating exploitation. The profound, inescapable truth of human interaction is that we are constantly, relentlessly moving through a deeply invisible, highly complex web of constant, overwhelming psychological influence. Every single highly commercial interaction, every deeply political speech, and every seemingly innocent social encounter is heavily saturated with these deeply hidden, highly manipulative triggers. The massive, highly lucrative industries of modern marketing, deep political campaigning, and aggressive, high-stakes salesmanship are entirely, completely built upon the deep, profound mastery of these very specific, highly predictable human vulnerabilities. They dedicate massive, heavily funded departments, utilize incredibly sophisticated, deeply advanced data analytics, and employ thousands of highly trained, deeply specialized professionals entirely focused on optimizing, perfecting, and continuously deploying these deeply hidden, highly manipulative psychological weapons against a completely unsuspecting, highly vulnerable public. The deeply unaware individual, blindly moving through this heavily mined, extremely dangerous psychological landscape, is completely, utterly defenseless against this massive, highly coordinated assault on their own autonomy. They continuously, repeatedly fall into the exact same, heavily constructed psychological traps, actively handing over their hard-earned money, deeply surrendering their valuable time, and completely compromising their own deeply held, highly personal values, entirely completely unaware that the completely automated, deeply hardwired mechanics of their own brain have been masterfully, successfully hijacked. They heavily rationalize their completely manipulated decisions entirely after the fact, desperately constructing elaborate, completely false logical justifications to deeply protect their highly fragile, deeply vulnerable ego from the truly terrifying, completely unacceptable realization that they have been completely, utterly played. The heavy, dark curtain of deep, profound psychological ignorance completely prevents them from ever truly seeing the highly skilled, deeply malicious puppet masters actively, masterfully pulling the invisible, deeply hidden strings from the dark, heavy shadows. This primal, deeply terrifying force, the ultimate weapon in the vast, heavily guarded arsenal of the compliance professional, is the absolute, unyielding law of scarcity. The fundamental, deeply hardwired architecture of the human brain is completely, entirely biased toward the massive, overwhelming avoidance of loss, vastly prioritizing the desperate protection of existing resources over the highly uncertain, deeply speculative acquisition of new, potentially beneficial gains. When an individual is suddenly, violently confronted with the terrifying, highly imminent prospect that a highly desired object, a deeply valuable piece of information, or a completely unrepeatable experience is about to become entirely, permanently unavailable, a massive, highly disruptive psychological short circuit violently occurs. The deeply logical, highly analytical centers of the brain are instantly, completely overridden by a massive, deeply primal surge of pure, unadulterated evolutionary panic. The highly critical, deeply essential concept of psychological reactance completely, thoroughly explains this terrifying, incredibly predictable behavioral phenomenon. As opportunities become significantly less available, humans instantly, violently experience a massive, deeply agonizing loss of personal freedom. The human psyche absolutely, fundamentally despises and violently rebels against any sudden, deeply restrictive limitation placed upon its fundamental right to freely choose. When a specific item is heavily branded as incredibly rare, highly exclusive, or strictly available for a completely limited, rapidly vanishing period of time, the deeply subconscious brain does not merely, simply desire the highly restricted item more, it violently, desperately demands it, actively perceiving the sudden scarcity as a direct, highly aggressive attack on its own fundamental, deeply cherished autonomy. The heavily targeted individual completely, utterly forgets to logically, rationally ask themselves if they actually, genuinely need the highly promoted item. Their entire, heavily compromised cognitive focus intensely, violently narrows down to the single, deeply terrifying thought that they might absolutely, completely lose the highly fleeting opportunity to simply possess it. To completely, viscerally understand the sheer, overwhelming absurdity and the massive, deeply terrifying power of this completely irrational, highly emotional response, one must closely, carefully examine a deeply personal, highly illuminating experience involving a massive, deeply intricate architectural structure and a completely sudden, highly unprecedented restriction of public access. In a quiet, deeply conservative suburban city, a massive, highly secretive religious organization completed the extensive, deeply complex renovation of one of their most sacred, highly restricted temples. For decades, the massive, highly imposing internal sanctuary of this deeply revered structure had been completely, strictly off limits to any individual who was not a heavily vetted, deeply committed member of the specific religious faith. The completely closed, heavily guarded doors entirely represented a massive, deeply impenetrable barrier, successfully keeping the curious, highly inquisitive eyes of the general public completely, utterly locked out. However, immediately following the massive, highly expensive renovation, the organization made a highly unusual, completely unprecedented public announcement. For a deeply limited, rapidly approaching period of just a few short days, the massive, highly secretive doors would be completely, entirely thrown open to the general, highly secular public. Anyone, regardless of their deeply held personal beliefs or entirely absent religious affiliations, would be completely, freely allowed to deeply, intimately explore the highly restricted, previously forbidden interior of the massive, completely mysterious temple. After this incredibly brief, highly fleeting window of unprecedented opportunity violently snapped shut, the massive, heavy doors would be permanently, irrevocably sealed once again, completely, utterly barring all future public entry forever. The highly observant researcher, a deeply analytical, highly rational man who had absolutely, completely never expressed even the slightest, most microscopic hint of genuine, authentic interest in the highly specific, deeply complex architectural nuances of religious structures, suddenly, violently found his own deeply rational mind completely, utterly hijacked. He had absolutely no deeply held theological curiosity regarding the specific organization, completely lacked any highly developed aesthetic appreciation for their highly distinct structural designs, and was actively, heavily burdened by a massive, incredibly demanding schedule completely filled with deeply important, highly urgent professional obligations. Yet, the absolute, undeniable moment he read the highly publicized, deeply sensational announcement heavily emphasizing the absolute, permanent finality of the impending closure, a massive, completely irrational, highly desperate compulsion violently seized complete control of his deeply logical faculties. He suddenly, frantically began entirely rearranging his massive, highly complex schedule, actively, desperately canceling deeply important, highly lucrative professional meetings and completely abandoning heavily pressing, highly urgent daily responsibilities, all entirely driven by the absolutely overwhelming, completely terrifying need to desperately rush across the crowded, highly congested city simply to stare blankly at a highly specific, deeply irrelevant building purely, entirely because he would absolutely, completely never, ever be allowed to deeply experience it again. The completely arbitrary, highly manufactured scarcity had successfully, completely transformed a deeply mundane, completely uninteresting structural artifact into an incredibly precious, highly coveted, entirely unmissable psychological prize. The researcher was not deeply, genuinely motivated by a completely rational, highly authentic desire to deeply learn or genuinely experience. He was completely, utterly driven by the deeply primal, highly terrifying, completely agonizing fear of permanently, irreversibly missing out. This incredibly dark, deeply potent psychological force reaches its absolute, most terrifying, and highly destructive peak when the sheer, massive pressure of extreme scarcity is violently, deliberately combined with the highly aggressive, deeply volatile element of fierce, direct human rivalry. The compliance professional deeply, fundamentally understands that a highly desired, deeply scarce resource becomes infinitely, exponentially more psychologically explosive when multiple, deeply desperate individuals are actively, violently forced to compete directly against one another for the exact same, highly limited prize. This deeply manipulative, highly calculated orchestration of artificial competition is heavily, masterfully deployed in the highly aggressive, deeply predatory environment of second-hand automobile sales. A highly skilled, deeply deceptive salesman, heavily armed with the incredibly dangerous, highly manipulative knowledge of behavioral triggers, heavily advertises a single, highly attractive, deeply underpriced vehicle to completely generate a massive, overwhelming flood of highly eager, deeply interested potential buyers. However, instead of highly logically, deeply rationally scheduling these incredibly eager prospects at vastly different, highly separated times throughout the entirely long day, the deeply manipulative salesman deliberately, masterfully schedules them to arrive at the exact same, heavily overlapping, deeply contested moment. The very first heavily interested buyer arrives, deeply relaxed, highly confident, actively taking their deeply leisurely time carefully, highly analytically inspecting the massive, deeply complex machinery of the heavily desired vehicle. They are entirely, completely operating in a highly rational, deeply logical state of mind, actively preparing to engage in the standard, deeply predictable, highly comfortable psychological dance of traditional, highly structured financial negotiation. They heavily point out completely minor, deeply insignificant cosmetic flaws, actively, deeply attempting to leverage these completely microscopic imperfections to systematically, highly logically drive the incredibly low price even further down into the heavily desired, completely comfortable negotiating zone. The highly deceptive, deeply skilled salesman completely, quietly plays along, heavily feigning deep, highly reluctant compliance, allowing the deeply unaware buyer to completely, falsely believe they entirely, absolutely control the heavily structured, deeply logical narrative. Then, entirely according to the highly manipulated, deeply deceptive master plan, the completely unsuspecting second buyer suddenly, completely unexpectedly arrives on the deeply contested, heavily engineered scene. The entire, highly relaxed, deeply analytical psychological atmosphere instantly, violently shatters into a million completely irreparable, deeply fragmented pieces. The deeply logical, highly comfortable negotiation is completely, entirely annihilated. The salesman, heavily adopting a deeply apologetic, highly authoritative tone, calmly, heavily informs the first deeply shocked buyer that the incredibly desirable, highly limited vehicle is currently being shown, firmly, heavily instructing the completely anxious second buyer to carefully, patiently wait their deeply contested, highly uncertain turn. In a massive, completely devastating, highly instantaneous psychological flash, the entirely targeted vehicle miraculously, completely violently transforms in the deeply irrational, highly panicked mind of the first heavily compromised buyer. It is absolutely, completely no longer a highly complex, deeply mechanical object heavily subject to deeply rational, highly logical financial evaluation. It has completely, violently become an incredibly scarce, highly contested, deeply precious prize that is actively, dangerously slipping away into the heavily aggressive, completely unknown hands of a highly visible, deeply terrifying, completely real rival. The deeply logical, highly analytical brain entirely, completely shuts down, heavily overridden by a massive, extremely violent, deeply primal flood of heavily intoxicating adrenaline. The highly visible, completely physical symptoms of intense, deeply aggressive psychological panic heavily manifest. The heavily anxious stomach violently tightens into a deeply painful, highly restricted knot. The completely frantic heart massively, deeply accelerates, heavily pounding against the highly constricted chest. And the entire, deeply vulnerable nervous system completely, violently flares into a highly agitated, deeply desperate state of complete, overwhelming red alert. The completely arbitrary, highly fabricated presence of a direct, deeply visible rival completely, violently obliterates any deeply lingering, highly rational hesitation, actively forcing the first highly compromised buyer to desperately, entirely abandon all highly logical, deeply strategic negotiation tactics and violently, immediately surrender the deeply contested, entirely full asking price, completely driven by the deeply primal, highly terrifying, completely overpowering fear of entirely, completely losing the highly manufactured, deeply artificial contest. The highly disturbing, completely chilling, deeply undeniable reality heavily exposed by this incredibly intense, deeply immersive analysis of these completely automated, highly reflexive psychological triggers is entirely focused on the massive, incredibly dangerous, highly precarious trajectory of modern human civilization. We are actively, relentlessly building an incredibly vast, massively complex, highly accelerated, completely overwhelming informational environment that absolutely, fundamentally surpasses the deep, natural processing capabilities of our highly ancient, deeply biological cognitive architecture. The sheer, massive volume of incredibly complex, highly nuanced data heavily bombarding our deeply exhausted, highly fragile senses every single, heavily compressed second is actively, violently forcing the deeply overburdened human brain to entirely, completely rely upon these highly simplified, deeply primitive, completely mechanical shortcuts with a massive, incredibly terrifying, deeply desperate frequency never before seen in the entire, highly complex history of our deeply flawed species. As the completely relentless, highly exhausting pace of deeply modern life continues to massively, uncontrollably accelerate, we are completely, actively losing the highly valuable, deeply essential time and the completely vital, highly necessary mental energy required to deeply, highly carefully, entirely rationally analyze every single, highly complex decision we are actively, relentlessly forced to make. We are completely, violently regressing, actively heavily retreating back into a deeply primitive, highly animalistic, completely automatic state of entirely mechanical, deeply reflexive response, actively relying on highly isolated, entirely single pieces of highly superficial information to completely, blindly dictate our heavily consequential, deeply impactful actions. The ultimate, incredibly profound, heavily weighted message that this incredibly immersive, deeply terrifying, highly psychological book actively, desperately intends to deeply convey to its completely vulnerable, highly exposed readers is a massive, completely uncompromising, deeply urgent call to intense, highly aggressive intellectual and psychological arms. It absolutely, fundamentally is not merely a deeply fascinating, highly academic exploration of completely quirky, highly interesting behavioral anomalies. It is a massive, deeply vital, highly necessary survival manual deeply, completely designed for an incredibly hostile, highly manipulative, completely overwhelming cognitive environment. The deeply profound, completely unavoidable lesson is that we absolutely, entirely cannot simply, completely abandon or heavily destroy these highly efficient, deeply necessary mental shortcuts. We completely, absolutely need the highly functional rules of reciprocation, the deeply stabilizing force of internal consistency, the highly informative power of massive social proof, the deeply comforting, highly necessary bonds of genuine affection, the highly efficient guidance of completely legitimate, deeply genuine authority, and the highly useful, completely natural signals of genuine, authentic scarcity to successfully, entirely navigate the massive, incredibly crushing, deeply overwhelming complexity of our entirely highly modern, deeply fractured existence. Without these deeply essential, highly automated cognitive processes, our massive, incredibly burdened brains would simply, completely freeze, entirely violently collapsing under the massive, deeply agonizing weight of endless, completely paralyzing, highly exhaustive analysis. However, precisely because these incredibly valuable, highly necessary mental shortcuts are absolutely, completely vital to our fundamental, deeply biological cognitive survival, we must actively, violently, and heavily aggressively rise up to fiercely, completely defend their fundamental, deeply structural integrity. We must entirely, relentlessly declare outright, completely uncompromising psychological warfare against any highly deceptive, deeply malicious, completely unethical compliance professional, deeply manipulative marketing organization, or highly aggressive, entirely predatory political entity that actively, consciously, and deliberately attempts to heavily hijack, completely falsify, or entirely counterfeit these deeply sacred, highly necessary cues. When a completely deceptive, entirely manipulative corporation deliberately, actively manufactures completely artificial, highly fake scarcity to heavily trigger a completely blind, highly irrational purchasing panic, they are not simply, merely stealing our deeply hard-earned financial resources, they are actively, completely poisoning the highly vital, deeply necessary informational environment we absolutely rely upon to safely, entirely navigate the highly complex world. When an entirely fake, completely unqualified, heavily deceptive individual deliberately, masterfully dons the highly powerful, deeply respected symbols of complete, legitimate authority to heavily extract completely blind, highly dangerous obedience, they are actively, fundamentally corrupting the highly necessary, deeply foundational structures of entirely civilized, highly functional societal trust. We must entirely, actively learn to completely, violently recognize the deeply physical, highly visceral, completely internal warning signals, the highly sudden, deeply restrictive tightening of the entirely anxious stomach, the completely rapid, highly unnatural acceleration of the deeply racing heart, the heavily overwhelming, entirely frantic surge of highly artificial, completely unearned emotion, that heavily, actively indicate a deeply manipulative, highly deceptive psychological trigger has been completely, violently activated. We must actively, fiercely develop the completely critical, highly essential ability to instantly, completely separate the deeply powerful, highly manipulative feeling from the completely underlying, heavily objective facts of the heavily contested, deeply complex situation, by deeply, actively understanding the highly intricate, completely invisible mechanics of these incredibly powerful, heavily structured psychological weapons. We absolutely, completely transform ourselves from deeply vulnerable, entirely blind, highly reactive psychological prey into entirely highly conscious, deeply aware, completely formidable intellectual defenders of our own deeply cherished, highly autonomous free will. The deeply profound, completely transformative understanding of these incredibly massive, highly hidden forces actively entirely grants us the completely immense, highly necessary power to entirely, completely reclaim the heavily contested, deeply vital sovereignty of our own incredibly complex, entirely beautiful, heavily targeted human minds. Influence is the art of alignment when used with absolute integrity, but when wielded by a charlatan, it is the silent theft of the human soul.